More gold for American gymnast Simone Biles. She won the women's floor exercise at the World Championships in Qatar, one of 6 medals she'll take home from this competition. Not bad, especially considering she spent time in the hospital right before this all started. Biles extends her own record for the most world titles for any gymnast in history, female or male. I'm Monica Cabrera in New York. Thanks for being here. Up next, a CNN special report, Democracy in Peril. The war on voting rights starts now.
The following is a CNN special report.
Look at how close he is.
Wisconsin was barely in play.
This is a reliably Democratic state.
It was pretty clear that this was an earthquake.
It was a shock.
The 2016 election was the first in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act.
Voters blocked from ballot boxes.
I'm trying to stop voters from committing fraud.
These voter ID laws are not to prevent voter fraud, but to keep certain people from the polls.
Voters stifled by rigged maps.
My neighborhood has been split. The line was drawn right through it.
Hasta la vista to gerrymandering.
Voter suppression is not a conspiracy.
If you make it harder to vote, then we should make it a lot harder for you to get reelected.
Now a new front in the war on voter rights.
What it takes is the boots on the ground.
The time has come for voter ID.
We've got to spring into action.
And the time is getting more urgent.
Tonight, a CNN special report, Democracy in Peril, the war on voting rights.
CNN now projects that Donald Trump will carry the state of Wisconsin.
Wisconsin traditionally has some of the highest vote turnout in the country. We are up there with Minnesota, North Dakota. We routinely have turnout in the 60 to 70% range of the voting age population.
Yet in 2016, Wisconsin saw its lowest voter turnout since 2000.
Right now, a historic moment.
It had been 7 presidential elections in a row where a Democrat had won the state. To think that Donald Trump could do
we will carry Wisconsin
what George W. Bush couldn't do, Mitt Romney couldn't do, or John McCain,
I won't let you down,
as previous Republican candidates, was sort of unthinkable.
The numbers are not what people think.
Trump carried the state of Wisconsin by only 23,000 votes.
Where were you election night, and do you recall watching the returns?
I was in Wisconsin.
Ari Berman is the author of Give Us the Ballot, one of the most comprehensive books on voting rights in America.
I had been with people all day who either were turned away from the polls or who had to make multiple attempts to vote.
So how did Trump win the traditionally blue state of Wisconsin? What happened?
This is not the outcome we wanted.
As the dust from the 2016 election settled, pundits continuously pointed to the same factors that could have swung the state.
Another letter by FBI Director James
The Clinton campaign simply took Wisconsin.
Hillary Clinton didn't go to Wisconsin.
There's WikiLeaks coming out.
The Russians didn't tell Hillary Clinton to ignore
Comey's letter
Wisconsin.
was instrumental in her defeat.
I don't think she was treated fairly during the election.
It impacted the election.
But others believe there was something else that loomed much larger.
The media totally missed a whole nother question.
Something that didn't get nearly as much attention as Hillary Clinton's missteps in the state.
Which was, were people going to be able to vote in the first place? That's the most underlying thing in a democracy, and I think a lot of people ignored that. Based on what I had been seeing, not only on election day, but in all the months before, of people being turned away from the polls, this was a concerted Republican strategy to try to make it as difficult as possible for certain people to vote.
Berman says the strategy to drive down Democratic turnout in Wisconsin and beyond came after President Obama took office.
This is their response to the election of the first black president. Their first instinct is to make it harder to vote, to try to decrease turnout among the Obama coalitions. The goal was to keep people from voting.
Is there a leader of the voter suppression movement in the state?
Scott Walker. and all of the Republican officials there. They've all been in on this.
Thank you on behalf of the people of the great state of Wisconsin.
Since taking power, Governor Scott Walker and Republican lawmakers have chipped away at voting rights in Wisconsin. In 2011, citing a need to prevent voter fraud, Walker enacted the state's restrictive voter ID law.
It's probably one of the strictest voter ID laws in the country. It requires a voter to show one of a small set of IDs. Has to have a photo, has to have a signature, has to meet expiration date requirements.
Lawmakers in Wisconsin eliminated the role of a corroborating witness. The other was the proof of residence document, something like a bank statement or a utility bill. But if you go back to that very transient population, how is a member of that population going to be able to prove their residence?
2016 was the first big general election where the voter ID law was in effect.
You have thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people, whose right to vote is interfered with or obstructed.
I, Donald John Trump.
After the election, political scientist Kenneth Mayer conducted a survey of registered voters in Wisconsin's 2 largest counties who did not vote in 2016.
What the numbers indicated is that there may have been, it's about 11% of people who didn't vote in our survey said that one of the reasons they didn't vote was they didn't have an ID in Milwaukee and Dane counties, which are the 2 biggest counties in the state. And we're talking about, just in these 2 counties, somewhere in the range of 6,000 to 13,000 people.
Was that enough Wisconsin voters to sway the outcome? Election experts did the math.
Donald Trump won the state by less than 1 percentage point. It was about 23,000 votes. From Ken Mayer's study, we know that there were tens of thousands of people in these 2 big counties, and probably more in the rest of the state, who were deterred from voting because of the ID requirement. The vast majority would have been Democratic voters. So I think it's not hard to see that the ID requirement probably had enough of a depressive effect.
She fought very hard.
That it could have denied Clinton the victory.
Is it a determinative factor? No. Was it a factor? Absolutely.
What do you say to people like the governor of Wisconsin? He called it pile of crap regarding voter ID laws.
Voter suppression is a fact, not a theory. You can read the court opinions. In Wisconsin, they found that 300,000 registered voters didn't have the forms of ID. I know Scott Walker probably doesn't want to read my articles, but it's out there.
Governor Walker declined CNN's request for an interview.
Voters in this state are going to have a very clear choice.
I think it is extremely possible that that is what happened.
Former Attorney General Eric Holder.
I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but it is entirely possible that had all those people not been disenfranchised, that the results in Wisconsin might have been different.
So you don't think it was just some accident?
No, I don't think it was an accident at all. I think they actually got what it is that they wanted. They impacted the electorate.
Coming up, the Crusaders. And later,
the form of voter fraud that we see most frequently is double voting.
When the stakes are this high, you need
the neighborhood today to see if you had any questions about voting at all. Hi, my name's Molly.
For voting rights crusader Molly McGrath, the age-old American tradition of grassroots organizing is still the best strategy.
We're just talking to folks today to see if you guys were registered to vote, if you need a Wisconsin state ID.
36-year-old McGrath, now a prominent voice in her home state, found a rather indirect path into voting rights advocacy.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi. I was Miss Wisconsin. That was kind of my first job after college.
So you're a beauty queen talking about voting rights?
Yes. Should I go get my crown?
After serving out her pageant term, McGrath earned her law degree in New York.
I found myself learning more and more about the suppressive tactics that states were taking, and that this ID law was going to be in place in Wisconsin in 2016 for the first time. And I knew that this was something that I wanted to work on.
We know that not having an ID is a big problem, but we also know that
I pivot, I think, between feeling really sad about it and really angry about it. And then, of course, incredibly motivated.
So motivated, she moved back home, where she now runs the ACLU's voter ID outreach program.
When Wisconsin passed this photo ID law, they added a whole other hoop for voters to jump through, and we're trying to lower that hoop, let's say. We want to make sure that everybody can vote, even in spite of this photo ID law. I can try again, but I think they're probably not. Yeah.
Today, Molly and her team of volunteers are on the ground in Racine, just outside Milwaukee.
These laws have been in place long enough where we see the communities targeted. We know that it's targeting low-income voters, voters of color, students, older voters.
Talking to the lady across the street,
Yeah.
they just moved their polling location.
Oh, really?
That really pisses me off. Because
Me
folks in this
too.
neighborhood that don't have a ride.
Right.
That's a serious hurdle.
So she
Is this experience and the change unique just to this state?
Unfortunately, no. We've seen an increase of laws that make it harder to vote.
In other states?
In other states across the nation.
According to the Brennan Center for Justice, since 2010, 23 states have passed new voting restrictions, from limits on same-day registration and early voting to photo ID requirements, like the one in Wisconsin.
I think the 2016 presidential election really demonstrated the impact of those changes.
In the 2016 presidential election, voter turnout was down statewide, but the decline in Milwaukee's poorest minority neighborhoods was jaw-dropping.
We lost 41,000 voters in the city. We saw a near 20% decrease in voter participation from 2012 to 2016. I have no doubts that there were people in the city of Milwaukee who didn't vote in that election because of the photo ID requirement.
As I feel like they really, really knew that the turnout this election would have not been the same, because a lot of people would not have their IDs.
Andrea Anthony was one of the thousands of Milwaukee residents who was unable to cast a ballot in 2016.
The right to vote is so important to me because it makes my little voice a bigger one.
Andrea had lost her driver's license, but brought her expired Wisconsin ID to the poll instead. For this election, that wasn't enough.
If you go and vote in Wisconsin, you don't have one of the IDs listed on that very limited list, you are given what's called a provisional ballot. And that's a ballot that will only count if you present one of those IDs to your clerk by Friday at 4 o'clock.
Between juggling 2 jobs and caring for her children and grandchildren, needless to say, Andrea never made it to City Hall. So for the first time in her life, she says, her vote wasn't counted. Andrea was planning to vote against Trump.
I feel in a way like and I know I'm probably putting too much on my shoulders, but I feel like maybe if I did follow through with it, it could have made a difference.
What do you say to the argument that it's not that hard to get an ID?
It might not be that hard for somebody like me, but it is hard for other people, for somebody like Anne. Hi, Anne. It's so good to
Molly.
meet you.
Good to finally meet you.
Yes, exactly. I'm so excited to go to get an ID today.
Anne Hochstad is 92 years old and lives alone on the outskirts of Madison. She's a lifelong Democrat and has never missed the chance to make her voice heard.
Did you vote in this election for JFK?
Oh, heavens, yes.
Hochstad didn't realize she now needed an updated ID to vote in Wisconsin until Molly came knocking.
Well, that's good. I can get in.
Yeah.
In like Flynn, honey.
All right.
Yep.
What do you think about these changes? You know, having to have your ID.
I don't understand why. What can an old lady like me do to hurt voting. This is the way we always come. So they're making mountains out of molehills is what they're doing, just causing more problems than we don't need.
You're walking faster than I am.
I don't think they care about us as people anymore. They really don't.
Coming up.
The time has come for voter ID.
There is a campaign against democracy going on in this country right now.
A once in 500-year storm should happen every 500 years, right? Fact is, there have been 26 in the last decade.
The President of the United States.
I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy.
You know, there's a long history of disenfranchisement in the South.
The harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes.
Everything from poll taxes, literacy tests, doing all the kinds of things that you could legally do to somehow make it more difficult for people of color, generally, African Americans in particular, to cast a ballot. The march from Selma to Montgomery was about getting people the right to vote. The Edmund Pettus Bridge incident was all about the right to vote. And all of that work led to the 1965 voting.
Perhaps the biggest blow to voting rights in America came not from new legislation, but from a single decision by the nation's highest court in Shelby County versus Holder.
In June of 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act.
This is really the end of a major era in American history because
nearly 50 years after President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, a key provision of the landmark legislation was struck down.
I am deeply disappointed with the court's decision in this matter.
This decision restores an important constitutional order.
Edward Bloom is a conservative legal strategist behind the Shelby County lawsuit and dozens of other lawsuits challenging race-related laws across the country.
There will always be racism in this country. The question is, how do we diminish it? If you tell me the way to diminish racism is to grant preferences to those who have suffered, I'm telling you that's the wrong answer.
In the Shelby County case, Bloom took aim at Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the provision which gave the federal government authority to oversee election laws in a handful of states, states with long histories of racism and voter discrimination.
Section 5 was a product of 1965. It is no longer 1965. African Americans participate in the polls. The nation changed. Politics changed, but that statute didn't change. Now everyone is on equal judicial footing.
What do you think of people saying that these protections are not needed anymore?
Well, I say that, yeah, we have made substantial progress, but we're not yet at the place where people have equal access to the polls.
I think it's undeniable that over the last few years, almost every one of the new restrictions that we've seen disproportionately affects voters of color and voters of lesser means.
Including recent attempts by Republican-backed officials to shutter polling sites that don't have disability access. Voting rights advocates say these attempted closures are likely yet another veiled tactic to disenfranchise minorities.
It's very suspicious. And it suggests that there's something nefarious going on. If more evidence comes out and that evidence suggests that these are intentional efforts to suppress minority voting, it wouldn't surprise me.
And it's not that we've gone back, it's actually that the civil rights movement never ended.
37-year-old Jason Kander, the former Secretary of State in Missouri and Army veteran, is a leading voice amongst Democrats in the new fight for voting rights in America.
When the heart of the VRA was gutted,
What was your reaction to that?
My reaction to that was, one, disappointment, and two, a sense that we got to gear up, because it was a starting pistol for the Republican Party to say, go out and pass all your laws that make it harder to vote. We believe that in America in 2018, if you make it harder to vote, then we should make it a lot harder for you to get reelected. That's what we think.
We met Kander in July in Las Vegas.
There you go, Miss. Send that to her as soon as we're done.
Where the grassroots organization he founded in 2017, Let America Vote, is opening one of 5 new field offices in the run-up to the 2018 midterms.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for joining us.
It became really clear to me that the voter suppression strategy I'd seen the Republicans run at the state level in Missouri when I was the Secretary of State, that was about to be run on a national level. And the way that looks is basically this. Step 1 is they undermine faith in American democracy.
I'm afraid the election's going to be rigged. I have to be honest.
Step 2, they create obstacles to voting.
I strongly support voter ID laws.
And then step 3, they create obstacles to those obstacles.
They're voting like really early. And we have to discuss that early thing. That's.
I argue it is the #1 strategy of the Trump re-election campaign.
How can you be so sure it's a strategy?
I mean, I've had plenty of Republican elected officials speak with me privately and tell me that they're disgusted by what they hear in their Republican caucus meetings, and that it absolutely is a political strategy. And they secretly tell me that they really appreciate what I'm doing. Making it harder to vote, that is an un-American thing to do. There is a campaign against democracy going on in this country right now, and the Republican Party has just embraced it.
The time has come for voter ID, like everything else. Voter ID.
Next.
Democracy is supposed to be responsive to the voters. And, you know, like that seems like a lie.
Sue Johnson is a lifelong Wisconsinite and one of the plaintiffs in Gill v. Whitford. The challenge by Democratic voters to state legislative maps drawn by Republican lawmakers in 2011. Johnson argues those districts gave the GOP an unfair advantage in winning state House seats.
So my house is in the 91st Assembly District, which is a new district that was drawn around the city of Eau Claire. And then on the other side of the street, my neighbor Russ and the Millers were left in the 68th Assembly District. So the line literally goes down my street.
Drawing those lines to favor your political party is called gerrymandering, considered by many to be another form of voter suppression.
I know that, you know, millions of Americans don't have a say in their democracy, and that's not okay.
Ruth Greenwood may be the most unlikely crusader in the fight for fair maps in the U.S.
How odd is it that an Australian expat is carrying the mantle for democracy?
I don't know, maybe it's that you need to come from outside to realize how crazy the system really is.
Greenwood studied election law at Columbia University in New York, where she met her future husband, fellow lawyer Nick Stephanopoulos. Today, she's a voting rights attorney determined to put an end to partisan gerrymandering.
I have friends who say, oh my goodness, have you heard about this gerrymandering thing? And I'm like, no, literally, I've been yelling about this for years.
So have politicians.
It's very difficult for us to try to draw these lines.
They have been gerrymandering.
The fight's rigged because of Democratic gerrymandering.
Hasta la vista to gerrymandering.
If you look at the districts, they're all sliced up. They run this way, and they run that way, and they run that way. It's drawing districts not based on a natural concentration of people, but to try to achieve some political end by manipulating the maps.
Gerrymandering boils down to packing and cracking. Packing supporters into a small number of districts where their preferred candidates already win by huge margins, or cracking districts by scattering voters and diluting their influence. With advances in data crunching, maps can be manipulated with laser-like precision, winding down streets and carving out blocks to slice and dice the electorate.
That's how we get the funny-shaped districts.
I mean, you don't just naturally get a district called Goofy Kicking Donald Duck based on where people live.
This one looks like an earmuff. It's Illinois' 4th congressional district, drawn on the wedding cake of the legal duo.
When we started out this case, people thought we were kind of crazy.
Together, they're litigating gerrymandering cases in North Carolina and Wisconsin.
At its most extreme, the practice amounts to rigging elections,
with the potential to set legal precedent for the entire nation.
We've seen the exact same combination of voter suppression and rampant gerrymandering in the whole set of purple states where Republicans found themselves in control after the 2010 election.
In 2010's red wave, state legislatures across the country flipped from Democrat to Republican, giving the GOP control over redistricting. 2012 was the first year the newly drawn maps were used. That year, Democrats running for Congress won over 1 million more votes than Republicans. But the GOP sent 33 more members to the House of Representatives.
What happened with the maps in Wisconsin in 2011?
I just think this is outrageous. They had a locked room. They spent 3 months drawing districts that would very clearly advantage them.
Carving the maps, honing them to maximize their advantage.
You have more people going and voting for Democrats, and yet in Wisconsin, 60% of the House, are Republicans, and that just feels wrong.
Democracy is supposed to be responsive to the voters, and that seems like a lie.
Defenders of partisan gerrymandering say it's been around since the founding of the republic. It's a privilege of the party in control.
Show me what democracy looks like.
This is what democracy looks like.
During its 2017-2018 term, the Supreme Court heard several gerrymandering cases.
It's not just Republicans doing this or Democrats doing this. It's politicians doing this to try to protect their own power.
It is about power.
Absolutely. Gerrymandering is fundamentally about power.
I think we've got to end the practice of drawing our congressional districts so that politicians can pick their voters and not the other way around.
Former President Obama has taken up the fight to end gerrymandering, teaming up with former Attorney General Eric Holder to create the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. The NDRC backs candidates and ballot initiatives pushing for map reforms.
We have supported reform efforts like ballot initiatives that allow for the creation of these nonpartisan commissions to draw the lines in 2021.
While politicians take aim at voting booths, Wendy Sue Johnson and the other Wisconsin plaintiffs wait on a verdict.
We're not going to give up until we can fix this thing.
Voter fraud panel.
I look forward to the findings, so the full truth will be known.
It doesn't take a huge amount of voter fraud to tilt an election result.
Trump tapped Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach to head up his Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Back in 2016, it was Kobach who propped up Trump's claims that he would have, quote, won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally.
I think the president-elect is absolutely correct when he says the number of illegal...
There's just no evidence. There has never been any evidence that that was true.
Kobach's assertions have made him enemy number one for voting rights advocates.
Chris Kobach is the architect of voter suppression nationwide. He was someone who was writing anti-immigrant legislation well before Donald Trump called Mexicans rapists and murderers.
He's one of the nation's leading proponents of a myth, really, that non-citizens are trying to participate in our elections.
We have to get serious about enforcing the law against those who come in illegally.
In the mid to late 2000s, Kobach drafted and defended local ordinances in Pennsylvania, Missouri, Texas, and Nebraska.
Don't turn a blind eye.
He wrote Arizona's controversial Show Me Your Papers law that authorized police to stop anyone if there was reasonable suspicion they were undocumented. In 2010, Kobach won his bid for Secretary of State, buoyed by one singular promise.
I will stop voter fraud in Kansas. When I was running for Secretary of State in 2010, Kansas was somewhere in the middle. But my objective was to make Kansas number one, the state with the strongest laws to discourage and deter election fraud.
In 2013, Kobach ushered in some of the strictest voting limits in the nation, requiring people to show proof of citizenship when registering to vote and to present photo ID on Election Day, laws that would later be challenged over and over in federal court.
What we saw in Kansas was that 1 in 7 new voters that tried to register were blocked from registering. If he's able to succeed and pass these kind of laws on a nationwide basis, it will have a very suppressive effect on voting in this country.
In 2015, claiming hundreds of non-citizens were on the voter rolls, Kobach convinced the state legislature to make him the only Secretary of State in the country with the power to prosecute election crimes.
How prevalent is the issue of voter fraud here in the state of Kansas?
The form of voter fraud that we see most frequently is double voting. People voting in Kansas and in another state in the same election.
In the 3 years Kobach has had the authority, at least 14 people have been found guilty of voter fraud. Most were older, many registered Republicans, often owning property in 2 states. Like Lincoln Wilson, one of Kobach's first targets.
I thought it was a crank call. He says, "Is this Lincoln Wilson's?" Yes, it is. And he said, "The Secretary of State has filed 3 felony charges."
Wilson was charged with double voting in 3 recent elections.
Are you part of a vast conspiracy to sway the election?
No, not by any means.
Wilson is a businessman who owns real estate in Kansas and Colorado. Since 2004, he's made the drive back and forth across state lines. He maintains that he never voted twice on a presidential or national ballot, but believed he had the right to vote in local elections.
Why did you think you could vote on 2 different ballots in 2 different states?
Because the state of Colorado law says that if you meet certain requirements, you are allowed to vote for those local issues in the county that you own those taxes on.
But the state of Kansas didn't see it that way.
State of Kansas does not see it that way.
That misunderstanding, he says, shattered his reputation.
If I was robbing banks, I know at some point that they're going to show up. This was a total surprise, an absolute surprise.
Wilson spent 18 months fighting Kobach's charges.
What were all the penalties you faced?
Years of prison time and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
What is it like for you to hear that?
It's hard to hear that, and it's hard to see him go through that.
He eventually pleaded guilty to 5 misdemeanors and paid a fine of $6,000.
I think we're very much pawns in a political pursuit.
One of the people who was prosecuted is Lincoln Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
They believe that you pursued them and the other citizens for political gain.
No.
To prove a point.
No, you have to deter double voting by imposing a fine on those who do it.
He voted for you. Twice.
I don't care. I don't care whether the person is Republican or Democrat. You're not supposed to commit fraud, and you can only vote once.
So far, of the 15 people charged, only 3 have been non-citizens.
This hardly suggests that this is widespread, though. Out of 1.8 million voters.
You have to remember, the convictions are just the tip of the iceberg because so few cases are discovered.
Discovering evidence and data, the goals set by that election commission, formed by Trump and led by Kobach. Less than 6 months after its first meeting, the commission disbanded.
What happened to the commission?
Literally, the commission's work ground to a halt because of all the lawsuits.
In March, the man behind Trump's voter fraud obsession was back in federal court, aiming to prove his claims of widespread illegal voting. The ACLU challenged his proof of citizenship law, claiming that more than 35,000 Kansans were blocked from registering to vote. Next,
what's at stake here is whether or not proof of citizenship moves forward in other states and whether it continues on the books in Kansas.
This is not a video game. This is not a screensaver. This is the destruction of a cancer cell by the body's own immune system, thanks to medicine that didn't exist until now. And today,
For the legal team on the Wisconsin gerrymandering case, the wait was interminable.
We started investigating this back in 2014, really talking about it in 2013.
Then on Monday, June 18th, word came like a bolt of lightning.
Actually, I was sitting over here, Nick was sitting over there, I started screaming.
The ruling was a mixed bag for Ruth Greenwood.
I think I swore a lot.
The court basically punted, stating unanimously that the Wisconsin plaintiffs failed to prove they had suffered the sort of injury that would give them the standing to sue.
We can prove it.
I wanted to just win, be done. We have fixed this all, and we're not at that point.
For observers who are hoping that this June would be the sort of the final battle, the final countdown for gerrymandering, that's not going to happen.
The news for voting rights is not good. The Supreme Court upheld voter purging in Ohio. They upheld racial gerrymandering in Texas. They refused to strike down partisan gerrymandering in Maryland and Wisconsin.
Yet there was some relief in lower courts. In North Carolina, the state court struck down its partisan map. And in Pennsylvania, the court overturned gerrymandered congressional districts, reshaping the map in time for midterms.
I think what happened in Pennsylvania is going to happen in the future, meaning that where there's really bad gerrymandering, people are going to ignore the Supreme Court. They're going to try to challenge it in state court.
How are you feeling today about court?
Very good, thanks.
In Kansas, Secretary of State Chris Kobach had his day in court and failed to support his claims of widespread voter fraud.
Even Kobach's own expert witnesses, his own witnesses, who were supposed to testify about the prevalence of fraud in this country, agreed that there was no evidence for his assertions.
Perhaps the most startling moment in the trial came when the ACLU's Dale Ho challenged Kobach's key witness on his methodology for finding non-citizens.
One of his samples, he adjusted statistically based on whether or not people had foreign-sounding names. I put a hypothetical to him. I said, what if you came across the name Carlos Murguia? He said, that's probably a foreign name. And I said, well, you're aware, are you not, that Carlos Murguia is the name of a federal judge who sits in the same courthouse that this trial was taking place?
And this science is being used to pull the ear of the president.
This science is being used to advocate for these restrictions on voting all around the country.
Kobach was held in contempt of court repeatedly during proceedings. And after 2 weeks of arguments, the judge struck down his restrictive voting law.
He got laughed out of federal court. The judge came down hard on him. It exposed the fraudulence behind the claim that voter impersonation and non-citizen voting, it really doesn't exist in any meaningful numbers at all, much less being rampant.
With the court ruling, Kansas residents no longer have to show proof of citizenship when they register to vote.
How you feel about your first day here?
I think it went fine.
But Chris Kobach is relentless in his crusade.
The case is going to be appealed.
Shouldn't the right to vote be something that's open and easier for people?
Not if you're a non-citizen. Not if you're trying to vote fraudulently.
Thank you, sir.
Despite his stunning defeat in court,
What an exciting race.
Kobach secured the Republican nomination for governor of Kansas and says he still has Trump's ear.
He is continuing to rise within the ranks of the Republican Party. Why is his power growing?
Well, I mean, I think part of his strategy is that if he keeps people from voting, then it's a lot easier for him to continue to move up the ranks. It's that simple. President Trump backs this stuff for the same reason.
You need ID. In this country, the only time you don't need it, in many cases, is when you want to vote for a president. It's crazy.
Somewhere there is a whiteboard at the Trump campaign re-election office, and that whiteboard has the top 5 strategies to win re-election, and I think all 5 are voter suppression strategies. This is an election where so much is on the line, including democracy.
Hanging in the balance are basic rights for millions of Americans, the right to vote and the right to fair maps.
This is an extremely critical year. Half the people who will be at the table for redistricting in 2021 will be elected in 2018, the other half in 2020. And so we have to be successful this year. We have to be successful in 2020.
Democrats like Eric Holder with the NDRC are aiming for blue wave elections.
We have targeted 12 states as our primary targets, 7 other states that are on our watch list. And if you can fix the problem in those states, you would have a very substantial impact.
What Democrats can do is finally break unified Republican control in places like Wisconsin.
I think we'll have a blue something. Is it going to be a wave, a tsunami, a little trickle? I don't know. It's really hard to say.
Some wasted votes of Democrats out here.
What voters need is a non-gerrymandered map. We're still waiting to prove that we can accomplish that.
The time is getting more urgent. I feel like every other step of this has been completely exhausting. We've thrown ourselves into it, but it's been like, we have to do this. It's worth it. It's worth it. It's worth it.
It's a battle.
There's no question it's a battle. Power illegitimately obtained is not going to be surrendered without a fight. But I'm ready for that fight. Increasing numbers of people are ready for that fight.
I was just about to knock on your door.
Like Molly McGrath.
We just want to make sure that everyone has information on how to register.
With her army of volunteers near Milwaukee. And Wendy Sue Johnson.
I'm running for office.
The plaintiff from Wisconsin, now taking matters into her own hands.
I decided to step up and make sure that every election matters and contest the 68th Assembly District, even though it's a Republican gerrymander. This is still about the long haul. No, we're not having new maps for 2018, but the fight's not over. The fight's not dead.